Pay attention to this sequence.
I cannot believe he's still standing. Oh, and a follow-up left hand.
Did you see the setup? Because if you didn't, I'll show it again in slow motion. I didn't see it at first until I went back to analyze it, but in case you missed what actually happened, stick around and I'll tell you just how this worked and why it worked on other opponents. But for now, let's get right into the video. There's always that one fighter in the division who's an absolute menace to everyone. And this tends to be because they present some kind of unique threat that fighters just have a disastrous time dealing with. When it comes to Sugar Sean O'Malley, his use of longer range and his style has been really frustrating many fighters in the division. Along with this, with the walk-off knockouts, the flashy kicks, and exciting striking, these are just some of the reasons why Sugar Sean O'Malley has become such a polarizing talent to watch. And whether you like him or you hate him, it's hard to deny the entertainment that he produces. It's time to take a closer look at what happened in his most recent fight. O'Malley secured another win against Thomas Almeida with a pretty dominant performance. And with that, we'll be taking a look at O'Malley's signature moves, the tactics he used, strategies involved, and a bunch of other interesting stuff. I want you to stick around too, because Thomas Almeida actually did something really effective that even he may not have even realized. I'll tell you this a little bit more towards the end as we break down his approach to the fight, but for now, let's dive right into the fight between Sean O'Malley and Thomas Almeida. This was a very difficult fight for Almeida. Just looking at this fight stylistically, I've done analysis detailing Almeida's craft before, and a lot of Almeida's craft works really well against fighters who are willing to trade in the pocket and be stationary, but O'Malley wasn't having any of that at all. Malley is tall and he's pretty long for the division, and to make things worse, he fights very well at his optimal range where he could hit them but they can't hit him back. The best way to describe the tempo of this fight was that O'Malley had the luxury of controlling both the offensive and defensive portions of the exchanges. When he wanted to press forward, he would always attack the end of his reach, and one thing O'Malley would do was control the lead hand by striking at it to control Almeida's weapon before breaching through with something like his cross or his jab. And this was hard for Almeida to counter back since O'Malley would often pull away to avoid those counters. And this was incredibly hard for Almeida to counter back because as soon as O'Malley threw his strike, he was completely gone from the punching range in less than a second later. We often saw this so many times. By now, you could probably sense the frustration from Almeida's end. He just couldn't effectively counter back due to the game of inches O'Malley was playing. O'Malley's overall strategy was to strike at his optimal range, and he had a large variety of tools to do this. One tactic was to use his attack at range by using front body kicks. Malley tends to like following this up with a spinning kick. Now the front kick, it sets up the spinning kicks well because when you use the front kick, it pushes the opponent away and they instinctively move back into range. In a way, it forces them back to step into your attack, so you can actually time a spinning kick as they move back in. O'Malley's a little bit of a trickster when it comes to kicks. He'll often flash the appearance of a certain attack to open up other defenses, and then he changes his rhythm by transitioning into a different kind of kick. For example, here O'Malley feints a front body kick and then Almeida tries to parry it downwards. Then he uses the appearance of a front body kick again, but notices that Almeida actually shields his body a little bit more to brace a straight kick, but a head kick comes instead, right over that opening. You see him do tricky things too, like faking a kick to transition into punches. For example, when O'Malley went for hopping side kicks to the knee, and then switching his pattern from doing a side kick feint into punches. Or you might see him do the reverse, where he will feint a punch and transition into a kick, like here. Here Sean's gonna dip low to feint a shot, and Almeida tries to slip his head away from the shot, then O'Malley throws a head kick to the slipped head. So as you can see, this is the kind of tricky manipulation that O'Malley uses to draw certain reactions in order to create openings. He tends to have a diverse blend of rhythm when feeding different kicks at such a long range, and this gives him the edge as a longer fighter who's able to work at such a distance. O'Malley has a bunch of creative kick setups, but we'll just be covering what was observable in this fight, and we'll save more of his craft for the future when we revisit him again. For now, let's take a look at some of his punching setups. In his knockout of Eddie Wineland, we saw his setup he used to get the job done, and this is where he threw a fake uppercut lead, and then he threw his power hand shot. Now keep this in mind because the uppercut fake draws Eddie to actually reach for the uppercut to catch it, but leaves him opening for other shots. In his fight with Almeida, he tried this tactic several times, throwing the uppercut fake to set up the power shot. He actually managed to drop Almeida with this same tactic at one point. So let's revisit that uppercut from the beginning of the video. So pay attention to O'Malley. He's gonna throw the uppercut fake with the rear hand, and what that's gonna do is that it's gonna cause Almeida to close his frontal guard a little bit more to protect against the uppercut. And then O'Malley's gonna flash the lead hand, and then Almeida's gonna actually prioritize the frontal guard even more. You're gonna see him switch his guard just a little bit, but as he does that, he actually leaves around the guard open, and that's how O'Malley is able to go around the guard. So now you see just how handy that uppercut fake is when it comes to manipulating the opponent's defenses to create certain openings, and we saw that with Almeida, and we saw that with Eddie Wineland when he was able to manipulate the hands a little bit to open up his shots. The Almeida knockdown that led to the moment where O'Malley thought the fight was finished and he attempted a walk-off. I'm kinda glad that he actually didn't finish the fight though, because we at least got to see how the fight played out a little bit longer to watch other developments. There's another kind of feint that O'Malley uses to set up his hands, and this tends to be a head feint, where he would look away before moving into attack. Now there's various ways of feinting, and there's pros and cons of different methods, so there's really no wrong or right way to do it. You just do what kind of works for you. Most fighters tend to use their shoulders and hands to feint more so over than just using the head alone, and there's a very specific reason for this. In fighting, there's an old school of thought that suggests you should keep your eyes more focused on the opponent's chest. Now the reason for this is due to the fact that fighters will often feint with just the hands or the head to draw some kind of reaction. So the combat falling for these kind of feints, some fighters will actually train to focus more on what the core of the body is doing, and that's because the core is the origin of where most of your strikes come from. Everything you do starts at the core, so when your body moves from the core, it's more of a giveaway that something is actually about to happen. By focusing on the opponent's chest area, it's easier to distinguish what's actually coming than to focus on something like a feint from the head or a feint from the hand. I bring this up because O'Malley actually likes to feint using the head to throw off the opponent's rhythm. Like I mentioned, it's a little bit harder to bait a reaction with something like this, like a subtle head movement rather than a core movement. I'll give you an example of a feint style that's a little bit more convincing to the opponent. So in this example, Conor is going to throw his shoulder as a feint. Now Nate is going to preemptively react, but Conor follows through with his shot to throw him off guard. Now this shot is a little bit more convincing because the core of Conor's body is moving. This makes the feint much more convincing and threatening because a lot of his body is acting in motion. Now this is what makes Conor and McGregor's feints a little bit hard to deal with in general, because it's really hard to distinguish what's actually a threat. When he engages with the shoulder feint, his shoulders are no longer quite squared up because he's posturing forward. This means he doesn't have the full range of motion for a power shot, so he loses some of that potential energy, but he makes up for it because the shot is a little bit more believable since a lot of his body is being engaged. This is why his feints tend to be pretty effective. And here from my illustration, you can see the difference in how much range of motion you have when you're posturing forward a little bit more using the feint. And just to give you an alternate angle to study from, watch as I posture forward with my head and my shoulders to feint. I'm using a little bit of my range of motion to sell the feint, and then I delay my shot for a split millisecond, then I use the rest of the range of motion to finish the attack in order to break that rhythm. So in full, it kind of looks like this, where the feint forward, delay my shot very slightly, and then go for the shot right afterwards. And this tends to be a rhythm breaker that both Conor and Israel Adesanya like to use. I just wanted to bring up different feint styles to help you compare and contrast other methods. When you see a fake like O'Malley's look-away fake, it tends to be a little bit less convincing since a lot of the core isn't being engaged in the movement, and this is partially why Almeida didn't quite bite on a lot of these head fakes from what I was able to observe from the fight. For example, just look at some of these instances. As O'Malley does a look-away fake, Almeida doesn't quite react to it, but he does dip because he knows something is coming afterwards, and then he finishes with his own hook counter. And another example, he does a look away, Almeida doesn't quite react, but he knows something else is coming after, so he dips under the shot. There's actually some real advantages to using the head fake. First, the head fakes don't really have to set up the shots, they could be used to gauge reactions, kind of like what Dominic Cruz uses. His fakes often are used to read what the opponent's reactions and attack when they become inactive or present openings. O'Malley's feints kind of serve the same purpose too. For example, O'Malley does a look-away fake, Almeida does a dip, he notices that, reads that reaction, then does the look-away again to bait that reaction in order to exploit him with the knee. He misses the knee, but it was a good execution of tactics. There's a neat benefit from using the look-away fake. When O'Malley fakes, he's only twisting his head off right to the side. This doesn't engage the shoulders at all, and what this means is that the fake with the head actually keeps his shoulders chambered in a neutral position. This actually allows him the full range of motion to deliver a potential power shot. There's one more benefit to using the head fake, and I'll let O'Malley explain it here in this interview.
Then you were doing a lot of like this look away head shakes into the knee. You were kind of like even dancing around. Is that just something you do in camp or just in the moment right there?
I've been doing that for a long time. I think I did it when I fought on the Contender Series. I've been doing it for a long time. I spin a lot, obviously. I spin pretty fast. You know, spinning to the body, spinning to the head. That's a dangerous shot when you land it. So doing a fake spin, they got to react to it, whether it's high or low, and come back with a 2. So it's something I've been throwing for a long time.
Just to recap, since O'Malley uses a variety of different spins in his striking style, his head fake can actually be useful because turning the head is a precursor to spinning around to do different spinning attacks. So when Malley uses the look away, it helps sell the spinning attack a little bit better so that he can transition into a variety of different attacks instead. For example, using a head fake look away into a knee, or using a head fake look away to a boxing entry. Malley does have other head feints too that work occasionally, for example his tactic to look down and then fire his jab cross. After experiencing notable leg injuries in the cage, O'Malley seemed pretty irritated at the narrative surrounding his legs. So far, he's had some weird leg injuries in the cage from his fights with Sukumtat where he injured his foot but still managing to still win. Then there's also the fight with Chito Vera, where Vera damaged his peroneal nerve, taking away a lot of his movement, which eventually led to his defeat. Coming into this fight with Almeida, there was speculation on whether leg kicks would be the key to taking another victory over O'Malley. It turns out that O'Malley actually had the more effective leg kicks in this fight, always killing Almeida's stance and cutting the calf. O'Malley made it a point to show that leg kicks weren't going to be as big of an issue this time. He did a fair job of evading kicks and baiting some of the kicks out.
I just want to ask you a question about the way you switch stances. Is there something he does that makes you decide to do that, or do you just like to go back and forth, fluid, the whole fight regardless?
I keep him guessing. How is he supposed to, what is he, he wants to kick my legs going into that fight. I knew, he wanted to kick my legs. It's hard to kick my legs. I'm switching stances and moving as much as I do. It's just, part of my skill set.
He mentions one of the way he dealt with leg kicks was by switching his stance. This prevents opponents from having a static leg to attack, and it helped O'Malley a little bit more in mitigating some of the damage to the legs. His stance switching had a little bit of an interesting thing about it too. To throw a spinning back kick, you generally want to step your lead foot across your body because this actually allows you to clear a path so that you could fire the spinning kick right down the line. So what was interesting about the stance switch was the fact that the opponent didn't quite notice the positioning of the footwork as a threat. So as O'Malley adjusted his feet, he put himself in a position to fire that spinning back kick. What might look like a simple stance switch could actually turn into a setup if you're not careful. Almeida's approach to this fight just wasn't effective at all. When it came to counterpunching, Almeida just couldn't land anything meaningful or find any kind of strategy that could work against O'Malley's offensive output. O'Malley was just too long and could easily pick and pull away before Almeida could get into range. When it came to going on the offense, Almeida only had one main strategy to get into range in order to land something, and this is where Almeida would shift forward, taking his head off the center line, and then coming back up with his lead hook. This is very similar to the tactic that Alexander Volkanovski used to close distance on Max Holloway. I believe his team refers to this technique as the step over, but the main difference here is that when Volkanovski uses this, he uses it with a series of different versions, so it makes it a little bit harder for someone like Max Holloway to actually predict and counter this. For example, instead of stepping over and popping up with that lead hook, he would mix it up and throw the power shot first and then step over with that lead hook. This meant that Holloway couldn't quite predict what version of the step over Volkanovski was actually using. When Almeida used a step over, he really only had one kind of rhythm and pattern when doing this, and combined this with the fact that he was relatively slow in his execution, it made it easy for O'Malley to predict it and counter it. Even O'Malley's corner noticed this.
He's way too slow, okay? Yeah.
This was one of Almeida's main ways to get on the inside, and he didn't have too many other effective ways of closing the gap. O'Malley was able to punish Almeida using the step over so many times, and this eventually led to the final knockdown where Almeida attempted to step over again. O'Malley saw a clear opening and he fired his cross right down to drop Almeida, and this is followed by the big shot that finished the fight. I did mention that Almeida did do one effective thing though. You see, Almeida had a really difficult time closing that distance. Simply put, most of the time he closed that distance, O'Malley would step back and counter him from his effective punching range where he could hit Almeida, but Almeida couldn't really hit him back. However, there was one neat moment where Almeida was actually able to counter O'Malley's own counter. When Almeida came in with a feint, O'Malley steps back to adjust his range just enough to where he could fire from his optimal punching range, safely outside of Almeida's punching range. But Almeida used a kick instead and left the exchange untouched. He effectively reversed the exchange by attacking in a kicking range where O'Malley couldn't reach him from his own punching range. Now this is important because Almeida was getting pieced up repeatedly, trying several times to close that distance. If he had continued using this strategy to counter O'Malley's counter, he would have done a much better job of punishing O'Malley's counter pattern. This works so well because the feint draws O'Malley to step back and fire his counter punch, but in doing so, he actually grounds himself to throw his counter punch. And during this time that he's grounded, he's susceptible to the leg kicks, and he's unable to check them. As effective as this might be, Almeida didn't quite capitalize on this at all, and I'm not quite sure he recognized his pattern enough in order to take advantage of this. I guess you could kind of call this a learning lesson for future fighters looking for ways to counter O'Malley's counter. Honestly, this could be a pretty useful lesson to take away when you're fighting someone with a longer reach than you and they're looking to step back to counter up punches. You can use this to bait their counters and punish their reactions by using the leg kicks to cut their legs when they're trying to counter with the punch. In the end, the story of this fight was dictated by O'Malley's superior range and his crafty ways of setting up those shots that he consistently sets up, just like that uppercut fake. If you really like this kind of content, please consider subscribing to this channel because there's a lot more in store for us as we learn more from fights in the future. And also be there with us when we discover the interesting technical stories of different battles along the way. I'm looking forward to covering the Robert Whittaker and the Kelvin Gastelum fight next, because that was a pretty fascinating fight. So hit that notification button because I have a lot of details to share with you that you might find really intriguing.